All right, guys, today we're talking about Jeffrey Dahmer. Yeah, that guy. You've probably heard his name, but trust me, his story is even crazier than you think. Grab a snack, actually, maybe don't, and let's get into it. Jeffrey was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. His parents, Lionel and Joyce, already had a pretty rocky relationship. His dad was this super smart chemist, logical, a real by the book kind of guy, but he was emotionally distant, not home much. His mom, on the other hand, was anxious, unstable, and dealing with some serious mental health issues problems. Not exactly the best environment to grow up in. Now, when Jeffrey was just a kid, his parents thought he was cute and normal, like nothing out of the ordinary. But as he got older, things started changing. He became more distant, acting out in weird ways, and his parents had no idea how to deal with it, but they didn't know what to do to help him and they didn't do much. When he hit primary school, Jeffrey was that quiet, shy kid who never really fit in. He didn't have many friends, and honestly, people saw him as an outsider. He wasn't really part of any group, and he'd just keep to himself. Some kids even bullied him. Jeffrey's thing was his dark sense of humor. People thought it was weird, and that just made him even more of an outcast. On top of all this, Jeffrey's mom, Joyce, was dealing with her own mess. She was on a ton of prescription meds, which left her tired all the time. She'd sometimes sleep the whole day away, so she wasn't really there for Jeffrey when he needed her. His dad, Lionel, was studying chemistry at university, so he wasn't home much either. Long story short, Jeffrey was left alone to deal with his emotions. Jeffrey felt very lonely. No one really paid attention to him. As if that wasn't enough, Lionel and Joyce's relationship was falling apart fast. They were always arguing, sometimes in front of Jeffrey, and it created this toxic environment at home. Joyce was constantly sick and in bed, and Lionel was too busy with school and work to pay attention. Things just got worse, and instead of making it better for Jeffrey, their constant fighting just pushed him further into his own world. Lionel and Joyce knew their marriage was falling apart, but they didn't want to get a divorce because of Jeffrey. They probably thought staying together would be better for the kids. But in reality, their constant fighting and problems made the home an unhealthy place for Jeffrey. When Jeffrey was about 6, his family moved to Ohio for Lionel's chemistry studies. By this point, Jeffrey was already showing signs of being a withdrawn, unstable kid. Then his mom got pregnant again. Now, a new baby in the house is a big change for any kid, but for Jeffrey, his parents were actually worried about how he'd react. Joyce, already dealing with her mental health issues, was scared that Jeffrey wouldn't accept the new baby. She thought if they forced this change on him, he'd lash out even more. So, in a desperate attempt to make him feel included and not completely ignored, they let him name his new baby brother. And that's how he picked the name David. It was like their way of saying,
See, Jeffrey, you're still important.
but let's be real, no baby name was gonna fix what was already brewing inside him. But here's where it gets really creepy. When Jeffrey was about 7, he started getting super obsessed with dead animals. He'd find them around the neighborhood, like a squirrel or a roadkill raccoon, and he'd collect their bones. He would spend hours examining them, completely fascinated by the process of death. His dad, Lionel, thinking it was just a normal curiosity, and he would sometimes help Jeffrey collect these animals, and they'd dissect them together. But what Lionel didn't realize was that this wasn't just a simple interest in science. Jeffrey was developing something darker. By the time he was 14, Jeffrey told his dad that his obsession with dead animals had actually started to turn him on. Lionel, not recognizing how serious this was, brushed it off like it was just a phase. He probably thought it was just some weird teenage thing, but it was way deeper than that. Jeffrey had begun to feel this pull toward death, and that feeling wasn't going away. Then, when he was about 14 or 15, Jeffrey did something that was ugh. He found a stray dog, brought it home, and instead of taking care of it,
He killed it.
and cut it apart. His parents found out about it, but once again, they didn't realize how messed up this was. Lionel just thought it was a weird thing, but didn't think it was a sign of anything more dangerous. All right, now let's talk about Jeffrey Dahmer's high school years. This is where things really started going off the rails. In high school, Dahmer was basically the definition of an outcast. He was that one weird kid everyone kind of knew but didn't really know. He was awkward, had no real friends, and just didn't fit in. But instead of being the quiet kid who kept to himself, he tried to get attention in the weirdest ways. One of his go to moves, fake passing out in the middle of class or in the hallways. Yep, just randomly dropping like a sack of potatoes while everyone stood around like, is he okay? It was part of this bizarre, drunk class clown act he did. He'd slur his words, stumble around, and collapse on the floor, trying to make people laugh. Thing is, he was serious. He wasn't just acting wasted, he actually was drinking, like real alcohol. This dude was sneaking vodka and beer into school in a freaking thermos. While other kids were drinking soda or coffee, Dahmer was out here chugging hard liquor at 8 a.m. like it was a totally normal thing to do. All right, let's talk about the divorce drama because honestly, Jeffrey's home life was already a dumpster fire, and this was just the final explosion. So by the time Jeffrey was 18, his parents, Lionel and Joyce, finally called it quits. And honestly, about time. Their marriage had been on life support for years, constant arguing, stress, and absolutely no concern for how it was messing up their already unstable son. But instead of handling the divorce like responsible adults, they turned it into a total mess. Joyce, who was already battling anxiety and basically living off prescription meds, decided to take Jeffrey's younger brother David and leave. And we're not talking a friendly departure. She straight up left Jeffrey behind like, good luck, kid, I'm out of here. Lionel, on the other hand, wasn't exactly father of the year either. Instead of staying behind to, support his deeply troubled son, he moved into a motel. That's right, Jeffrey was literally abandoned in the house. No mom, no dad, no brother, just him, an empty house, and his increasingly disturbing thoughts. In 1978, right after finishing high school, Stephen Hicks, an 18-year-old hitchhiker, was walking along the road. He was on his way to a rock concert, just trying to catch a ride. Now, Jeffrey, who happened to live nearby, saw him and thought, perfect opportunity. So he pulled up and was like, hey man, I live close by. Want to come over, have some beers, chill for a bit before the concert? And Stephen, thinking it was just a friendly invite. I mean, free beer? Why not? So they went back to Dahmer's house, drank, listened to music, and hung out. At first, everything seemed normal, but after a while, Steven was like, all right, cool, I gotta go to that concert now. And that's where everything went wrong. Jeffrey didn't want him to leave. This wasn't about friendship for him, it was about control. The thought of Steven walking out that door triggered something inside him. He panicked. Instead of letting him go, he grabbed a dumbbell and hit Steven in the head from behind, knocking him out. But it didn't stop there. After taking Steven's life, Dahmer didn't just get rid of the body he experimented. He later admitted that he acted on his uggers over the corpse because, in his mind, this was the ultimate way to have someone who couldn't leave him. The next day, he realized he had a huge problem. He had a dead body in his house, and he needed to get rid of it. At first, he left the body in the basement, but the next day, he started the cleanup. He dragged Steven's body into the bathtub, took a cutting tool and cut it into pieces, arms, legs, torso, and head. He stuffing the body parts into garbage bags, drove them out to a wooded area near his house, and covered them up. In late 1978, his dad Lionel was still trying to get him on the right path. Dahmer enrolled at OSU, Ohio State University, but instead of hitting the books, he hit the bottle. Hard. If there was a class on binge drinking and skipping lectures, he would have been top of his class. He barely showed up for anything. He only lasted one semester before completely flunking out. His dad, Lionel, was beyond frustrated. He had no idea about the dark secret Jeffrey was already carrying. He just thought his son was a directionless mess. Since college wasn't working out, Lionel figured, all right, time for plan B. And that's how in 1979, Jeffrey Dahmer ended up joining the US Army. His dad thought some good old-fashioned discipline would straighten him out. In 1979, Dahmer enlisted and went through basic training. At first, it seemed like he was doing okay. He got assigned as a combat medic and was stationed in Baumholder, West Germany. But let's just say Jeffrey Dahmer was not exactly army strong. For starters, his drinking problem got even worse. Like he was already drinking like a fish in high school, but now with access to alcohol all the time, this man was on another level. He was constantly wasted, skipping duties, and just being an overall mess. But that wasn't even the worst part. Billy Joe Capshaw? Yeah, he was Dahmer's roommate. Poor guy. He later said that Dahmer assaulted him multiple times, and every night was like living in a horror movie. Imagine trying to sleep knowing that the dude in the bunk next to you is a full-on creep who won't stop staring at you like you're a steak dinner. But it gets worse. One night, Dahmer got completely hammered and confessed to Preston Davis that he had killed a man. Davis was like, Dahmer straight up told him he had murdered someone and cut up the body, but he said it so casually, like he was talking about what he had for lunch. Davis later admitted that at the time he didn't even know how to react. Like, what do you even say when a guy casually drops that info on you? Oh, cool, man, I killed a spider once. Davis and Capshaw both said they reported Dahmer's behavior to their superiors, but surprise, surprise, nothing was done. The army pretty much ignored it. But by 1981, even they had had enough of him. Instead of giving him a dishonorable discharge, which he definitely deserved, they decided to let him go early with an honorable discharge because technically he wasn't considered dangerous, just an alcoholic who couldn't function. Yeah, great call, guys. And just like that, Jeffrey Dahmer was kicked out of the army. But instead of getting help or turning his life around, he just kept getting darker. After getting booted from the army in 1981, Jeffrey Dahmer was basically lost in life. No college, no job, no plan, just a guy with a drinking problem and nowhere to go. He landed in Miami Beach, got a cheap motel room, and picked up a job at a sandwich shop. Sounds like a chill setup, right? Wrong. He was still drinking nonstop, blowing all his money on booze, and basically living like a homeless drifter. Eventually, he couldn't even afford rent, so he started sleeping on the beach. After a few months of this messy lifestyle, Dahmer realized Florida wasn't working out. He called his dad begging for help, and Lionel, who probably had no clue what else to do, bought him a toy kit back to Ohio. When Jeffrey crawled back to Ohio in late 1981, his dad Lionel took him in, but with conditions. By now, Lionel had remarried, and Jeffrey wasn't exactly the ideal stepson. He was moody, distant, and still drinking like a fish. Lionel and his new wife, Shari, tried to set some ground rules: no drinking, get a job, be a functional human being. But of course, Jeffrey being Jeffrey, he didn't follow any of it. He got a job at a local deli, but instead of, actually working, he was drinking on the job and acting weird. It didn't take long before he got fired. To home, things weren't much better. Lionel and Shari tried to help him, but Jeffrey wasn't changing. He was always drunk, acting creepy, and making everyone uncomfortable. At one point, he even got arrested for disorderly conduct because he was drunk and causing a scene. Lionel and Shari had enough. They couldn't handle him, but they didn't want to just throw him out on the street. So Lionel came up with an idea. Let's send him to Grandma's. Now, Grandma Catherine Dahmer was the sweetest lady ever. She lived in West Allis, Wisconsin, and was super religious, kind, and patient. Lionel thought that maybe, just maybe, Grandma's love and discipline could straighten Jeffrey out. So in 1982, Dahmer packed up and moved in with his grandma, and for a little while it actually seemed to kind of work. But as we all know, that didn't last. So while living with his grandma, Dahmer was already doing some weird, suspicious stuff, but this was next level. One day in 1988, Dahmer read in the newspaper that a young guy had passed away near where he lived. And instead of having a normal reaction like, oh, that's sad, his brain went somewhere completely different. Dahmer actually went to the funeral home where the boy's body was being prepared, and he tried to steal the corpse. Yes, you heard that right. He literally planned to take a body from a funeral home. It's 1986, and Dahmer is still living with his grandma. By this point, he's already been acting strangely, but nothing had really landed him in serious trouble yet. That is, until this incident. One day, two young boys were near a river when Dahmer did something really inappropriate. He exposed himself in front of them. Of course, the kids were shocked and upset, and they immediately told their parents, who wasted no time calling the police. Dahmer was arrested and taken to court, where he tried to talk his way out of it. His excuse? He told the judge that he had just been relieving himself and that the kids must have seen something by accident. The judge wasn't buying it. Dahmer was found guilty of indecent exposure and was sentenced to a year of probation along with counseling. Now, looking back, this should have been a red flag. This was a moment where maybe someone should have stepped in and thought, hey, this guy might need some serious help, but instead he got a warning and was free to go. Now, Dahmer's second victim was Stephen Tuomi, and he met him in a gay bar in 1987. Stephen was 25 years old, and Dahmer approached him at the club. They had a few drinks and decided to go back to Dahmer's apartment. Dahmer later told investigators that he was drinking heavily, and after they got to his place, he didn't remember much. He blacked out. When he came to, Stephen Tuomi was dead, and Dahmer had no recollection of how it happened. I'm not going to go into detail about every single one of Dahmer's victims because honestly, it's way too disturbing. But just to give you an idea, for 1978 to 1991, he took the lives of 17 young men and boys. Most of them were people he met at bars, clubs, or just out on the street. He would invite them over, usually offering money for photos or just to hang out, and things would take a dark turn from there. Now, here's where things get next level disturbing. Dahmer wasn't just harming people, he was obsessed with keeping them in his life in ways that no normal person could even think of. He kept body parts in his apartment, and yes, he even ate parts of his victims. So, Jeffrey's grandma was honestly super patient with him. She let him live with her for years, even when he was bringing random guys home at weird hours and making the house smell questionable. But eventually, she'd had enough. In 1988, she kicked him out, and honestly, good for her. She did way more than most people would have. She probably thought she was just dealing with a weird, troubled grandson, but in reality, she was living with someone who had some seriously dark secrets. So off he went back into the world on his own, and well, things only got worse from there. After getting kicked out of his grandma's house, Jeffrey wasted no time finding his own place. Like, seriously, he moved out and had an apartment almost instantly. It didn't take long for Jeffrey's neighbors to notice something was seriously off. I mean, bad roommates are one thing, but when your whole apartment complex starts smelling like a mix of roadkill and a science experiment gone wrong, people are gonna talk. The folks living around him at 924 North 25th Street started complaining about a horrible smell coming from his apartment. One neighbor, Pamela Bass, even said it was so bad it made her gag. And when people asked him about it, Jeff had excuses for days. Oh, my freezer broke and all my meat went bad. I had some tropical fish, but they all died. Just some bad pork chops I forgot about. The worst part, people believed him. Like, yeah, the smell was nasty, but no one imagined what was actually happening behind those walls. In 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer attempted one of his most disturbing experiments, trying to create a zombie who would stay with him. He lured 14-year-old Conorak Sintasamphone to his apartment, drugged him, and then drilled a hole in his skull, injecting hydrochloric acid into his brain, hoping this would make him completely obedient. Jeffrey left the apartment to buy beer. Conorak miraculously woke up and stumbled outside, half conscious and barely dressed. Two women saw him and called the police, but when officers arrived, Jeffrey calmly convinced them that Conorak was his 19-year-old boyfriend who had just had too much to drink. In a shocking failure, the police actually walked the boy back to Dahmer's apartment and left him there. Jeffrey Dahmer was finally caught July 22, 1991, and it all started when one of his would-be victims, Tracy Edwards, managed to escape. That night, Dahmer had lured Tracy to his apartment with the promise of money in exchange for some company. But as soon as Tracy stepped inside, he knew something was off. The place smelled terrible, there were weird chemicals everywhere, and there was even a blue drum in the corner. But the scariest part? Dahmer locked the door behind him. At first, Dahmer tried to keep things casual, but then he pulled out handcuffs and tried to restrain Tracy. He also held a knife to him and made him sit down, telling him to stay still. Tracy, realizing he had to play along to survive, stayed calm and kept talking to Dahmer, pretending to go along with whatever he wanted. But inside, he was just waiting for the right moment to run. After hours of tense conversation, Tracy finally saw an opportunity when Dahmer got distracted. He punched Dahmer in the face, bolted for the door, and ran into the street, barefoot and still partially handcuffed. He flagged down two police officers and told them everything. At first, they were skeptical, but when Tracy led them back to Dahmer's apartment, everything changed. The moment the officers stepped inside, the smell hit them hard. They saw the photographs Dahmer had taken of dismembered bodies lying around. That was enough for them to cuff him. But the real horror came when they searched the apartment. They opened the fridge and found a human head. Then they found more body parts in the freezer. There were also jars filled with preserved organs and even bones in drawers. His trial began on January 30, 1992. He faced 15 counts of murder, and while he pleaded guilty, his lawyers tried to argue that he was mentally ill. The prosecution, however, made it clear that Dahmer knew exactly what he was doing and had carefully planned everything. The jury agreed, rejecting the insanity defense and finding him legally sane and guilty on all charges. The judge sentenced him to 15 consecutive life sentences, 957 years in prison. During the trial, Dahmer apologized to the victims' families, saying he never wanted to cause them pain. but his words didn't change anything. So after he got locked up, you'd think he'd be miserable, right? Nope. Dude was out here chilling, giving interviews, and basically acting like he was the main character. He even told people he had found God, like, bro, it's a little late for that. But prison life wasn't all smooth for him. Other inmates obviously hated him. I mean, he literally admitted to doing some of the worst things imaginable. But what made it worse, Jeffrey wasn't exactly keeping a low profile. He would joke about what he did, even making his food look like body parts to mess with people. Enter Christopher Scarver. This guy was already in prison for murder, and he was not a fan of Dahmer. One day in 1994, Jeffrey Scarver and another inmate, Jesse Anderson, were assigned to clean a bathroom at the prison gym. Now, somehow, maybe the guards accidentally looked the other way. Scarver ended up alone with Jeffrey and Jesse, and let's just say he didn't waste the opportunity. Scarver grabbed a metal bar from the gym and went off. He first attacked Dahmer, hitting him in the head multiple times. Then he did the same to Jesse Anderson. By the time the guards found them, Dahmer was barely hanging on. They rushed him to the hospital, but he didn't make it. Jesse Anderson also didn't survive. Scarver later said that he did it because God told him to, and he felt like Dahmer had no remorse for what he had done.